Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined by my guest today, Dr. Michael Dobberstein, to discuss the destruction of Beaver Lake and the Kankakee Marsh. He's Professor Emeritus of English at PNW, and he got his Ph.D. in English from the University of Utah. You worked with the Nature Conservancy at the Beaver Lake Basin,
yes,
which is one of the ways that got you really interested in this particular book.
When I retired, I volunteered for the Nature Conservancy. It's an area they call Kankakee Sands, and it's the old lake bed of Beaver Lake. They're restoring it to prairie, and I was a volunteer there for a while.
My question was, why did you choose John Locke? I know he had some connection with Thomas Jefferson, but why did you choose John Locke in particular?
I was very interested in the phrase from the Declaration of Independence where Jefferson said we all have the right to the pursuit of happiness. And that's the interesting phrase. What exactly does that mean? And it's interesting that we have a right to the pursuit of happiness. Apparently, we don't necessarily have the right to happiness.
That's right.
But we can run for it. That's a phrase from John Locke. Jefferson was a keen reader of Locke. A lot of the ideas in the Declaration of Independence come from Locke. The idea that all men are created equal is kind of a Lockean idea, and that's a very important part of the Declaration of Independence and kind of part of everybody's idea of what America is all about. So that's why also Locke I wanted to talk about how people see nature, especially how people saw nature in the 19th century, and they were heirs of the 18th century, the Enlightenment. People saw nature as completely useless, which is a Lockean idea. Now, Locke wasn't the only person who had that idea, but Locke was very influential in intellectual circles in the 18th and 19th century. And he kind of formulated this idea that human labor puts the value on nature. Nature is worthless. It doesn't have any value whatsoever.
Until somebody comes and cuts down the tree and turns it into lumber.
That's exactly right. When it's lumber, then it's worth something. When it's a tree, it's not. It's worthless. People thought that way in the 19th century. They certainly thought that way about Beaver Lake and the Kankakee Marsh. So there was a Lockean idea there. And I wanted to talk about values in that first chapter, which I call an essay on value, because of themes that I was going to connect with later, especially in the final chapter, but themes I think that kind of emerge in other parts of the book.
One of the things that you discuss in the opening chapter also is about the Potawatomi Indians, a Native American tribe.
Yes.
What happened to their rights to land and labor?
Their rights were never recognized, and their labor was never recognized.
Yeah. They were just forcibly removed at some point. They were
in 1838. Well, in 1832, most of the Potawatomi, gee whiz, I'm not sure if it's most or just a lot, but there were certainly a number of Potawatomi bands in a tribe called the Potawatomi in northwestern Indiana. In 1832,
and in Michigan.
And in Michigan, yes. Wisconsin, Indiana, and Michigan. And the Potawatomi in Indiana in 1832 or so, by treaty, just sort of decided, okay, you can have our part of Indiana. That's what they told the state. The state had been pressuring them for years to just give it up, So they sold it, I forget for how much, and they moved to Kansas. But a large number of them
They were forcibly removed to Kansas, right? No?
The 1832, by treaty, Potawatomi left on their own, but there were Potawatomi still in northwest Indiana, mostly in the Plymouth area in St. Joseph County, led by a chief named Menominee.
Yeah, there was one section where you talked about the Potawatomi had camps, and they would stay for the summer and the fall and do the hunting, and then they would pack up and
way back in the 1820s, and before that, they would. The marsh and the Beaver Lake, we'll get to this later, I suppose, were incredible environments, natural environments for waterfowl and fish. I mean, it's hard to exaggerate the number of species and the number of just sheer birds were on Beaver Lake or the marsh at any given time. So, Beaver Lake, which was the biggest lake in Indiana, it was a huge lake. These were sort of open air markets, which were free. The Potawatomi lived there mostly in the wintertime, in the fall. In the summertime, when the mosquitoes got too bad, they went up to Lake Michigan,
Yeah.
and they came back in the winter and in the fall. There were fewer waterfowl there during the winter, but they were still there. But there were Potawatomi in the eastern part of, the state, in northeastern part of the state, who didn't go to Kansas in 1832. In 1838, the governor of Indiana decided that those Potawatomi had to go too.
Yeah.
So he rounded up about 100 volunteer militia, gave them muskets, and they all went over to Chief Menominee's village, which wasn't very big. They surrounded it and said, "It's time for you to move." And Menominee said, "I'm not going anywhere. I've got a treaty." And he did. He had a treaty with the government of Indiana that said he could stay there with his people, but nope, they said you had to move. And so they packed all those people into wagons, and they forced them to go to Kansas. And many died. The Potawatomi called it the Trail of Death. I quote a source in the book as saying that 30 people died, mostly children, on that trek. There may have been more. There certainly are estimates of far more people having died than that. I just kind of took the low estimate. But a famous poet once said, "After the first death, there is no other."
Yeah.
So 30 people dead, 100 people dead. People died because they were forced to move, and that's the important part. But yes, they were forced out.
I don't know if you were quoting John Locke or you were just saying this, that it was human nature to get rich. I just wonder if that's actually something that's human nature, like
Locke thought
naturally.
it was. Locke thought it was. Locke thought it was.
As opposed to something that was more culturally imposed.
Well, I think it's culturally imposed.
Yeah.
But Locke thought that, he's not as clear about this as he might be. But he seems to think that people will naturally want more than they really need.
Yes.
He talks.
And he thought that was wrong.
He thought that was wrong.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it happens, and he in fact he refers to the Indian in North America. He's writing in the 1690s at a time when people are coming to North America from Europe, and he's saying to the Indian in America, the venison that the deer that he kills for his venison, that's his. It's his property. He killed it. He owns it.
And he gets to eat it.
And he gets to eat it, But the fact that the idea, he wasn't too worried about or the impact that Europeans were going to have on native people. Now, perhaps in the 1690s that wasn't a big issue. Certainly not for an Englishman living in, a long way away.
So I also think that this was from Locke. At least that was my understanding from reading your introduction. That if you take more than is needed, that would be wrong.
Yes.
Is that correct?
He seems to say that, yes.
Yeah.
If you take more than you needed, that would be wrong. So in Locke's view, if he'd known about it, in the Lockean scheme of things, the people who wanted Menominee's land were wrong because they were taking more than they needed.
Yes.
I mean, these people had been there. Gee whiz, their people had been there for 10,000 years. But they were forcibly removed, as people were. Native people were all over the country, of course, because somebody else wanted their land.
Yep. So, again, I don't want to impugn you here, but it seems to me that you continue to question capital. You talked about how speculation, fraud, and greed entered the process.
Yes.
And Lynn Heasley, who you quote, argues that landowners undermined and risked democracy.
Well, she's talking about Jefferson's idea of private property. Jefferson thought that people ought to have private property because property would make them better citizens.
That's the idea.
That was the idea. That was Jefferson's idea.
Yep.
That's not how things have turned out. Private property has become a way to get rich.
Yep.
The more private property, especially if you have minerals and oil or whatever else on it, that will make you rich. Property has become, land as itself has become a kind of capital. People trade it around as like they do stocks and bonds or money. Landowners and the government of Indiana in the 19th century saw the Beaver Lake lands and the Kankakee Marsh and the Kankakee River as Indiana's property.
Yep.
It didn't seem to matter to them very much, especially with the river, which they were going to channelize. Of course, they were actually going to change. It didn't seem to matter to them very much that river ended up in Illinois.
You're going to try to make it straight.
Yes.
by using dredges and
Yes.
other
Yes.
equipment.
Yes.
So it no longer meanders through
Yes.
the state,
Yes.
but you're just going to have a nice straight channel,
Yes.
and all that sand and silt and everything is just going to end up in Illinois.
Oh yeah, they were okay with that.
Yeah.
In fact, when they started dredging the river, they started at the upper part. The Kankakee River begins around South Bend,
yeah.
just south of South Bend. And it meanders, well, in those days it meandered like crazy, all the way to the Illinois border. It's about 80 miles from where the river begins to the Illinois border. So we got a linear distance of 80 miles. If you put a boat on the river at South Bend and you managed to stay on the river all the way down to the state line, you would have gone about 250 miles.
Yeah.
Because of the crazy way the river bent, the oxbows and the meanders. In fact, there are about 2,000 of those meanders. And so people who wanted to drain the marsh realized they had to have a channel to drain the marsh into. The marsh is this big, wet place. But there was no current in a river that goes like that, because a river that goes like that really slows the current down.
Yep.
It collects all kinds of debris and stuff, silt and sand or whatever. In fact, the bottom of the river throughout Indiana is sand. It's limestone in
Illinois. Yeah.
So there's a different river altogether in Illinois than there is in Indiana. So the people who settled in Indiana, after they, pushed the Indians out, really hated that river. They called the marsh useless. In fact, they said that the marsh
Was injuring
the land.
Yeah.
That was the phrase that was used,
Yeah.
often not a phrase, that was a word that was used in several contexts, that the marsh was somehow injuring the land because you couldn't farm it.
Yep.
So they hated the marsh and they hated the river. So the proposal advanced in 1853 was to straighten the river, to create a channel, to create a current in the river so you could drain the marsh and then it would all go away into Illinois.
And they ended up saying, I think that you said the farmland was worth 10 times more than marshland.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so now it becomes a commodity.
Yes,
Now it
exactly.
becomes something that can be sold and
Yes.
farmed,
Yes.
and the crops from the farms can be shipped to Chicago, and
And you could make a lot of money.
you could make a lot of money.
Yes.
That was that's the whole idea.
And there was a good bit of fraud surrounding land speculation, surrounding the sale of Beaver Lake lands in the 1850s and early 1860s. A lot of fraud.
So this would lead to land, water, air, natural life destroyed, all for the purposes of developing wealth.
Yes.
You would have smoky air, cut down forests, polluted streams, endangered wildlife.
Well, I quote some other environmentalists like Carolyn Merchant, who says,
Yes.
pretty much that thing.
Yes.
She wasn't talking about the marsh, but the marsh was, what happened to the marsh in the 19th century was happening to America all over.
Everywhere.
Yes.
Yeah. On the other hand, sportsmen and hunters favored saving the marsh and the lake.
Yes.
They
Yes.
wanted to leave things kind of in their natural
Yes.
state because, well, there were waterfowl there.
Yes.
It said that Congress gave 1.2 million acres to Indiana,
Yes.
draining the marsh, and gave it to cropland.
Well, the marsh was about 500,000 acres.
Yeah.
The watershed of the Kankakee River is around around a million acres. The marsh itself was about half that.
Okay.
So about 500,000 acres, which is a huge amount of territory.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the marsh. That's a huge marsh. It's a big landform,
Yeah.
all to itself, which is what they destroyed.
So who took, you say in here a couple times that Beaver Lake was taken. I guess the question is, who took it and how did they do that?
Well,
The judge, Charles Test, who was a judge, he blamed the speculators.
yes,
But it seems that the state officials aided the speculators
they did.
with fraud
They
and
did.
greed
They
and,
did. They
and
did.
even, you say, incompetence or ineptitude at some point.
The story of what happens to Indiana wetlands after the passage of the Swamp Act in 1850 is really startling. Apparently, when Congress created territories, which eventually became states, the federal government hung on to the wetlands in those places that became states. So all the wetlands in Indiana and other states too did not actually belong to the state. I'm sure the federal government had plans at some point to drain those places and encourage farming because they want people to, move into the country. But they didn't get around to it, so they just gave all that acreage back to the states. They gave millions of acres of wetlands to all the states that had wetlands. They suddenly became property of the states. Now the deal was, so the states had this property they didn't have before, which is really cool because you get to sell it and make money, right? The deal was that they were supposed to use the money they got for selling the land to drain the land, and they didn't. They never did that, as a matter of fact. They tried it for a while, and they didn't keep very careful track of who was doing what. And so there were, dozens of men who descended on the Beaver Lake area in the 1850s who convinced the swampland commissioner that they were going to go out and dig ditches to help, drain those marshes around there. And they didn't. But they claimed they did, and they got paid for it. That's the astonishing part. I guess nobody else went out and looked to see if there's really a ditch there or not. And this is the part that you just can't. You can't make this stuff up. The Indiana legislature had 2 investigations of those frauds in the northern part of the state. Newton County, it was called Jasper County then. Newton County was part of Jasper County, had the worst reputation for fraud. There were 2 investigative committees, and they concluded there was terrible fraud. They never arrested or fined anybody, not a single person. So, yeah. So either someone got paid off, or they were just stupid, or they were incompetent. They were all such crooks. I mean, that's what I think.
Yeah, well.
You can't find that in any history book, but that's what I think.
Michael Bright, you write about Michael Bright, who claimed that he had riparian rights, which gave him claim to Beaver Lake.
All of it.
But you suggest that Bright stole the lake from the public, while the state accepted Bright's land title. In other words, triumph of private property over public goals,
yes,
public interest.
That seemed to be what happened. Bright bought from the state. The state owned the feds had given the state the Beaver Lake, and the state sold all the land around Beaver Lake. You can't sell the lake; it's water.
Yeah.
Nobody could do anything with water, right? So they sold all the land around the water. It took Bright a couple of years to actually get the rights to all the land around it. And then he claimed because of riparian rights, he meant, since he owned all the land around the water, he owned the land in the middle of the water. Because riparian rights usually means if you own land on a river or a lake, you own the beach.
Yep.
And you owned a certain, a little distance out into the water so you could build a pier out there, for your boat or something like that. You have those rights. Those are what riparian rights usually mean. Bright took it to mean that if you owned all the land it wasn't a circle, but all around the water, you owned all the land up to the middle of the water. And then because you owned the land on the other side of the water, you owned all the land under the water. And he used that land as collateral. And the state legislature never questioned that claim. He walked into the recorder's office in Jasper County and said, here's my deed. And they show you a picture of the deed in the book. And the recorder said, okay, it's yours. You couldn't do that now, but in those days he could. And he could because his brother was the most powerful politician in Indiana.
We don't have a lot of time, but I thought we could talk about the rock ledge and moments.
Okay.
The idea was that Indiana wanted to reduce the height of the limestone bedrock.
Yes.
But they knew it was going to cost a lot of money.
Yes.
I think even when they got bids, they kept having to go back to the state legislature to get more money for the bids that existed.
Yes.
So you talk about the resignation of the board members, and the railroad in Illinois dissolved the board and all of Indiana's plans. So did the sand actually end up in the Illinois River?
I'm not sure if it got that far or not, but it sure ended up in the riverbed around Milmen's.
Yeah.
And the people around in that area, when the river was actually channelized in order to drain the marsh, people in that part of Illinois noticed it. They did. And engineers looking at the river and in Indiana and Illinois in 1930 noticed it. I mean,
Yep.
engineers way back when Beaver Lake was drained in that ditch,
Yep.
to the Kankakee River, engineers looked at the Kankakee River around the state line, and they could see sand there that was from Beaver Lake. So yeah, a lot of sand was going into Illinois. Nobody knows how much. In
So
fact, this becomes a huge problem in the 1970s.
The flooding just took off in 1954, 1970,
Yes.
78, 79. Flooding occurred almost every year.
Yes.
While Indiana became the garden spot, created the garden spot of Indiana.
Well, that's what the people who drained the marsh were going to call it, the garden
Right.
spot of Indiana.
Yeah.
But it was a very wet one.
So the La Crosse Land Company, the Tuesburg Land Company, the McWilliams Land Company had interlocking directorships, and they owned 50,000 acres of marshland.
Yes.
And then they used steam dredge boats to
Yes.
drain 46 acres of the marsh, and 250,000 acres were converted to farmland. So worthless lands became more productive
Absolutely.
in their estimation.
Yeah. Oh no, not just their estimation, Lee. The drained land, the drained marsh, was incredibly productive farmland. Some of the most productive farmland in the country. I'm not sure if it still is or not, but there's a lot of farmers there that would probably, they don't want to give up their farm because they make some money. But it was incredibly productive. It really was very, very productive soil. Here's another irony too. People thought the marsh was useless, but it was the marsh who created that productive soil. I mean, they called it muck soil because it was wet and it was so productive and it was so good for growing, especially corn, but all kinds of things. But it was the marsh that created that. So the marsh is what gave that so much, conferred the value on it that people converted into money.
So Indiana straightened 44 miles of or more of the
Eventually,
Kankakee.
it straightened all 80. It turned a 250 or 200 mile. Estimates vary about whether it was 250 or 250 miles. 200, 250 miles from South Bend to Momence, before the river was drained. But that 200 mile river was turned into an 80-mile drainage ditch between about 1902 and 1923.
So in the meantime, Illinois wanted a place of scenic beauty for resorts and recreation. So
Yes.
it seemed that the ecosystem of the Kankakee Marsh and 500,000 acres, all this was lost.
Yes.
Sandhill cranes, whooping
Yes.
cranes,
Yes.
trumpeter swans.
Yes.
And eventually, Meyer, who worked with Isaac Walton League, I guess.
Not exactly. Alfred Meyer didn't actually work with them, but he was inspired by them to, his dissertation was on the marsh. He was getting a Ph.D. in geography from, I think, University of Michigan. So he wrote his dissertation about the marsh. And he was very much inspired by the Isaac Walton League, which was formed in the 1920s in Chicago, as a matter of fact. And they took it as one of their first projects was to restore the marsh. That didn't happen, but they advocated for it.
We may be close to the end of our time. We could talk about your book and some of the insights that you have. I just think I should end with recognizing that you are in favor of conservation and in defending the environment, as opposed to turning everything into cropland,
Yes.
despite what it might do for
Well, we certainly need the
farmers.
cropland. I mean, we need farmers for sure. We need that cropland. I'm just not sure they had to take the whole marsh.
Yeah.
But they did.
That's all the time we have on our program. I want to thank Dr. Dobberstein for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. I'll see you next time.